The mixture of art and business can be a troublesome one. Sometimes you have to accept the outcome of your attempt to make your current vision, having to move on for the sake of business. Sometimes you go back to the grind because the current iteration is just not what you want it to be. That back and forth between art and business can drag on, and in some cases, for 10 long years. This was the case for Owlboy. Sadly, most owls looking for a hero to represent their heritage in this game never got to see it. A normal barn owl dies after 4 years. But luckily for us humans, we can benefit from D-Pad Studios' long and difficult journey. Owlboy is a unique adventure platformer that comes to Steam, GOG, and the Humble Bundle store on November 1st, 2016 for $24.99. I played the game for about 11 hours before doing this review, and beat the game. I did not do every side mission based on the achievements of the game, however. But here's the question. Will the wisdom of the owls be apparent in the game design from D-Pad Studios? Will it be able to complement a beautifully looking game with substantial gameplay? Or will all that time in development end up with a game that no one gives a hoot about? That's what I'm here to find out, but before I begin, this key was obtained from the developer for the purposes of review. That won't change my opinion of the game in the end, but you should know that because of FTC guidelines, as well as the whole morals thing, you know? Let's start with the story. You play as Otis, a young mute owl, training under his mentor Asio to learn the way of the owls. It's established early on that Otis is somewhat of an odd man out. His inability to speak, combined with some of his other weaknesses, end up making everyone from the typical schoolyard bullies to his own mentor to pick on him at almost every chance they get. Probably because he can't fight back, which immediately endears Otis to you. Luckily for Otis, he does have his best friend Getty at his side to back him up, who acts as Otis's voice and plays what I would call the paladin role in the story. But turbulence is coming to Otis's hometown of Valais, as pirates appear to cause some massive trouble for its citizens. The pirates are obviously looking for something from the get-go, as they don't directly attack the settlement, but make sure to put those in line who come across their path. As a town guardian, Otis and his friend Getty get involved, hoping to save the day and find out what exactly the pirates are doing at this isolated village. This ends up kickstarting Otis's coming-of-age tale that will take him through the various places in the game. From the capital city of Advent, with tall skyscrapers in the distance, to the caves and remote location of Mesos. Otis will learn about the history of the owls, who end up being the caretakers of this world. Of course, things aren't what they seem from the get-go, as the game does a great job of introducing new characters and weaving in new plot lines naturally in the game's storytelling. Speaking of which, the strength of the storytelling here is twofold. First, the set pieces that the game delivers are effective, as the twists and turns Otis and his friends go through will play with your emotions. You feel the weight of what's happening in the game, as characters will show the signs of being affected by its events. The writing here is what sells it, as the small details of conversation are paid the most attention to. These characters feel real thanks to down-to-earth language and reactions, even if the situation seems out of this world. Secondly, the pace of the story does do a good job overall of keeping you interested, despite some flaws here and there. No one section feels too drawn out, as the game keeps the plot moving with no real filler segments. It makes the missions that Otis has to perform much more effective, as it feels like, yes, this current event does require his immediate attention. However, I will say that there's a negative trait that develops in the game's storytelling. In particular, the plot more often than not misses a step in character progression. When a character changes a key attribute of theirs, you'd expect a specific build-up. Some example steps would be the following: a spark to put a character's core value at conflict, a realization of their own problem, and an eventual change in that character's behavior. But in Owlboy, half the time, it feels like one of those key steps is missing, that the character's change is accelerated, almost to the point where it can be unbelievable at times. Now luckily, that doesn't take away from the overall strength of the story that much. But I will say this, there's such an interesting world built here that I really wanted to see more side stories develop from the plot. There are some, such as the "I'd be really surprised if these penguins weren't influenced by Disgaea's Prinnies" and their relationship with their owner-employer. But those are few and far between. I hesitate to hold this against the game, however, because hey, the reason why I wanted more is that the main writing is done rather well. But overall, the story does deliver, and only the stone-hearted will not be affected by the game's events. It definitely pulled me in early and kept me interested until the story's conclusion, and that's the hallmark of a successful story. But story aside, one of the most striking elements about Owlboy has to be its presentation. While we've seen pixel platformers of all shapes and sizes over the last 5 years on the PC, Owlboy may be the best in capturing an upgraded 16-bit Genesis era type of aesthetic. I mean, just look at it. There's a variety of environments here that the game puts you in, and all of them have elements that draw your attention. For example, the Owl Temple has large monolithic carvings and statues that tell a story of ancient owls past. Meanwhile, you can see the background of Advent as you fight forces among its rocky island side. You'll see a lot of different environments throughout the game, and all of them have a unique feel thanks to some great artwork. Character designs are not to be overlooked here either. These characters are fun to look at, and a lot of detail is embedded if you look closely at them. There's little hints that you can take from the characters' designs when you first meet them, and you'll really appreciate it when it comes into play later on. Granted, the art style doesn't have the detail of the individual feathers like you may see in Skyrim conversion mods. But frankly, I like looking at this style more, because to me, it has more character. However, the devil is in the details when it comes to a game truly impressing me in any one element. Well, consider Owlboy to be the Devil's Slayer, because it nails the detail of its presentation. It's the polish via the small things here. Simple details like the grass and leaves swaying at the start of a scene, giving the right impression of wind for Otis to take flight from. Or it's the downright goofy facial expression of Otis when he's shocked by what he just drank. So much can be taken from that one expression, and only in a few bit of pixels. As for the sound design, it may be the weakest out of the presentation elements here, but that's not saying much. You get the rushing of water for a waterfall, and you get appropriate short sounds of action and combat with the firing of cannons or the whack of enemies. What I wanted more of was the actual characters actually verbally grunting or being involved in battle in terms of audio. Look, it's not bad sound design in the big picture. It's just that, well, the visuals are so striking that it sorta pales in comparison to it. But take a listen and judge for yourself. As for the music, the soundtrack is composed by Jonathan Gear, who also did the soundtrack for Neon Chrome. And well, if you needed a great soundtrack to accompany your adventure in the skies, Mr. Gear delivered here. It ranges from the slow and mysterious tones that emphasize the mystery of the environment around you, to the high-spirited beats that make you want to take flight. This soundtrack will be worth its own purchase when it comes out individually, and well, just listen to understand why that is. The presentation is most assuredly the best element of Owlboy, because, well, it's going to draw you in with its visuals, and it's going to keep you there with its audio and overall detail. Honestly, not a lot to complain about in this section whatsoever. But with all the other strengths that Owlboy has, its most unique element has to be its gameplay. While the game does have a lot of similarities to other platforming games and even top-down shooters, it all comes together in a relatively different package here. You've seen the elements of this formula, but not in this configuration specifically, which makes the game stand out gameplay-wise. So the gameplay has a couple of elements to it, but the game's structure is similar to the Metroidvania genre. There's exploration and platforming portions, but not to the length of a large sprawling castle like you'd see in Castlevania. You do have enemies and bosses that you'll come across during your adventure, and you'll have to battle them with a set of unique skills and weaponry, which I'll get into in a bit. Otis can move around the map by jumping platform to platform, but frankly, he's an owl, so of course he's going to fly. You have full reign of Otis when he's in the air, with a roll ability to help quickly dodge attacks and speed him up. He can also spin in the air as a melee attack. These controls will take a tiny bit of getting used to at first, but once you get accustomed to flying and how the game's physics perform, you'll be able to get through even some of the toughest obstacles. While some other reviewers have indicated that the controls are a little bit looser than they'd want, I don't agree. These controls give you exactly what you need for this gameplay. However, Otis doesn't exactly have a ranged arsenal as an owl. That's where his friends come in. Otis can pick up one of his comrades and let them fire their designated weapon to launch bullets at a relatively safe distance. He can switch between these members while flying with the flick of a button, which does have an actual in-game reason that's believable. Each of your comrades have a particular strength to their weapon as well. Getty is the Mega Man Blaster character, dealing small bits of damage with his constant onslaught of bullets. Alphonse has a blunderbuss, which does one big shot that can do devastating amounts of fire damage, but you'll have to wait for a long reload. And then there's Twig, who can wrap enemies in spider webs, immobilizing them to be meleeed or just ignored, and can hook across the screen to move around easily. With the skill set explained, how does the overall gameplay fare? Well, it's divided into a couple of different parts, and each of them have their own strengths and their own weaknesses. In terms of platforming, the game really does hit a strong variety. You'd think that wouldn't be the case considering that Otis can fly, thus making 80% of the platforms sort of unnecessary. But platforming in Owlboy is less about the solid surfaces that a Mario-like character would jump to. It's more about spaces to move Otis in a safe and timely manner. Whether it be slowly flying behind a set of mines as they rotate around a central point, or navigating the dark caves with barely any light, It's your job to avoid all the different hazards that are threatening Otis's small health bar. And that's where the game does well. It changes up the hazards constantly on you, forcing you to rethink about how you've used your skills up to that point. When you face a new puzzle mechanic, you wonder what exactly you're missing at first, but eventually figuring out that, oh, I need to use my skill in a different way here. In addition, the game does well pace-wise here, slowing down the platforming to be more precise at points, but then following it up with a speedy section that forces you to react quickly. You get comfortable with your skills, but you never get comfortable with the gameplay configuration at any point, which is exactly what you want for the genre. And within those platforming sections, there is a surprising amount of stealth gameplay. And despite my hatred of them usually in their implementation, I really enjoyed Owlboy's version of stealth. The thing is, these stealth sections had real consequences. For example, in this part, getting caught meant that poison filled the room, draining your health until you died. Now, you could turn off the poison by hitting an appropriate button, but that took a significant amount of skill and action in order for you to do. In other games of this type, it feels too binary in this case. Either A, you get caught and game over, or B, getting caught meant absolutely nothing in the big scheme of the game. Owlboy hits a nice middle in between those polar outcomes. Combat-wise, however, things are a little bit more shaky. Most of the enemies you face are rather simple in AI and in battle. Now, it's a bit different in having to carry your buddy for you to fire your weapons, and at first, it does feel like a breath of fresh air. When you get multiple enemy types in an area, and you have to switch back and forth between each character, things can really work in terms of fun, reactionary gameplay. But the biggest drawback of this game's combat is its lack of enemy variety and strategies in the long haul. The way the combat here works is simple. There's an enemy, and they have a specific weakness to one of your friends and or abilities, and use it to take them out. Sure, you can always use the less optimal choice in several of the combat scenarios, but frankly, you'd be pulling at Ash Ketchum in a Pokemon tournament in that case. Yes, Pikachu's your buddy, but choosing him to face a Lucario? Probably not the best option. And that's the thing. While the platforming keeps the variety within the game's sections rather diverse, that's not entirely the case for the combat portions. Usually you'll see the same enemies several times in a row, and frankly, the configuration for those enemies aren't that much different, considering that, hey, it takes the same skill to kill those enemies. When it does change, it works rather well, but that's too infrequent in that case. This also applies to bosses. When you get a unique boss that you haven't seen the mechanics for, you'll really enjoy it, even if the boss is a pushover in the end. You're forced to figure out the boss's patterns, figure out how to defeat them, and execute your plan of attack. It's simple enough, and some bosses do have segments that really are a blast. I loved the final boss of the game, and I loved riding a rockworm through the rocky tunnels in this segment. But on the flip side, you have several mini-bosses in this game that are just waves of singular enemies over and over again, and that got old rather quickly. Especially because the game doesn't do enough to make it a challenge, spawning those enemies in relatively the exact same place during the battle. This allowed you to get a nice blunderbuss shot in to completely wipe them out before they got going. Hell, if you purposely missed the shot by a tiny bit, you could end up dealing with one enemy instead of 6 and not spawning the next wave until you were good and ready. It was good the first time it happened in terms of these bosses, but not the remaining times, even if they were different enemies. There is one thing I need to make clear, however. Those looking for a brutally difficult combat game will not find it in Owlboy. Don't get me wrong, I died plenty of times while in the middle of combat. But the combat here doesn't necessarily take a lot of precision in terms of reactions or even aiming. To me, the comparisons to Shovel Knight that I've seen are unwarranted. The level of precision needed in combat is completely different in both games. This I would say is more novice friendly, which is fine, but I need to make those looking for that challenge aware that hey, Owlboy may not be your thing. I also found myself having small nitpicks that started to add up over time. For example, the linear type screen progression works in some cases, but I was surprised by an enemy off screen at times, even if I could have seen that guy coming if I had seen him in the screen before. It's also very easy to get lost and not know where the heck you need to go next. Even if it was a location that I had been to before, there's no map to reference here, and the location names started to blend together. The game doesn't do a great job of pointing you in a general direction for guidance like other Metroidvania games do. Verbally telling me I need to go to Advent is great, except I've never been to Advent. So yeah. Also, there was a lack of side quests. Now granted, based on the achievements, I seem to miss a couple, but they seem to be reasonably out of the way and just something that I naturally didn't run into. Now, it's possible I just goofed here, but I don't think I goofed that much. It would have been nice to see more hints in the game's plot about these side quests. Hints like, maybe you should go and find X before you leave. So, in terms of a gameplay summary, the game does really well in its platforming sections, and doesn't do as well in the combat portions. Overall, it does have enough here to make it enjoyable, especially with some of the high points of boss battles in the game. Just don't expect Shovel Knight levels of gameplay and level design here. Finally, let's talk about the technical aspects of Owlboy. Despite a long development cycle, some may be worried that the game would underperform technically, considering the beauty of its presentation and, well, the long development cycle. If you are one of those people, take those fears, load them into a cannon, and launch them into the atmosphere. Because in terms of performance, the game is excellent. 60 frames per second is the definition of this gameplay. And throughout the game, I don't think there was one point where I noticed a frame drop. Regardless of the environment, regardless of what was happening on screen, I saw the same performance throughout the game, and that's fantastic. It doesn't do over 60 FPS, however, as it does seem to be locked to that. But hey, 60 FPS for a game like this with absolutely no drops? Yeah, it'll do. It'll do rather nicely. As for load times, they're relatively few and far between. When they do occur, it's about 5 to 15 seconds, and it gets you right back into the action. Surprisingly, both the controller and the keyboard are usable here. I say surprising because of the nature of the flying gameplay, as the ability to move in every direction would seemingly give the controller the advantage with the control stick. But the directions that Otis moves in are actually bound to small segments within the 8 primary compass directions, even with that control stick present. So, both control schemes do work because of that, and complements the gameplay in question. I played mostly with the controller. As well, I was an NES kid. There were crashes I ran into, however, but I want to put an asterisk on a good amount of those, as there was only one real crash in my opinion. The other crashes I ran into seemed to be specific to my machine, and in particular with a crash dump option enabled in-game for me, while others who played it did not seem to have that option enabled. My guess is that something in my own development environment may have been enabled and turned that option on unexpectedly. But that's just conjecture on my part. Working with the developers, secretly turning off that option made those crashes go away. And those crashes weren't necessarily crashes in the gaming definition of crashes either. They were internal crashes, but the game was able to continue on after dumping some information. Regardless, it never lost me progress, and frankly, I didn't experience the problem on a second machine when I tried it. I'm giving the game the benefit of the doubt here, and how responsive the Owlboy devs were to the problem. Options-wise, it's alright. There are some good gameplay options with the ability to always turn on control prompts or not, and the standard audio sliders are present here. As to video options, you've got VSync and letterboxing, along with full screen. That full screen is technically windowed full screen, although the option for keeping the mouse bound in the game is weirdly in the gameplay section of the options menu. In addition, I would like to see some resolution options here in the video section for the future. The game does have bindable keys for the keyboard, but it does not for the controller. However, it does indicate that it can't auto-detect what type of controller you are using, which is weird considering that both controllers that I used seem to work just fine without any configuration. I'm not complaining about that at all, but keep that in mind going forward. Technically, where the game needs to be stellar, the game knocks the ball out of the park. Sure, there are some options I would want here, but when it comes down to it, the game plays like butter, and that's the most important thing. And hey, a DRM-free version of the game on GOG is always appreciated. In the end, I really enjoyed the 7 or so hours that it took me to beat Owlboy, and I still have more to do with some optional challenges that I seemingly missed based on the achievements. Its presentation is beautiful, and the gameplay does feel like a breath of fresh air compared to all the pixel platformers out there. It tells a great story, and you can see the amount of work that went into the 10 years of development here. However, there are some nagging flaws that do drag the game down for consistency's sake. And the price point may scare some people away, as games like Shovel Knight seem to bring more content for a smaller price tag. However, that's not enough to not recommend the game for purchase, as I give Owlboy an 86 out of 100, making it a solid purchase unless you're hurting for cash. But as always, take my enhancer system into account. Basically, if you are buying the game and strongly fall under the category of the enhancer-dehancer in question, adjust the score appropriately. If that changes the first digit of your score in the end, then reference my scoring guide in the description below. Remember, this score isn't a critical, this game is better by 5 points than another game type of scoring system. It's a buyability score, taking into account the game's launch price, the availability of similar experiences, and a variety of other factors. In this case, the game is a solid buy in most scenarios, and if you don't like the enhancer system, don't use it, because well, the main score applies for the most generic case. Anyway, thanks for watching. Considering the future of the channel, I don't know what's next on the horizon. Again, I will be looking for alternate work because of the lack of the channel's success and the lack of income, so I can't promise any new content at this point, at least in the foreseeable future. I will still produce content, of course, because people deserve more good critics in the end, just not at the rate that you expect from me over the last 2 years. But as always, keep on gaming.